In the winter of 1867, a fire consumed the Thornfield estate in Cumberland County, Maine. What firefighters found in the basement that night would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Rows upon rows of glass containers were discovered, each carefully labeled with dates, names, and strange symbols. Inside these jars, preserved in a sickly sweet, amber-colored solution, floated what appeared to be human brain tissue. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Scattered across wooden tables were hundreds of leather-bound journals. Their pages were filled with detailed drawings of human faces contorted in agony, accompanied by clinical notes written in an elegant feminine hand. The notes described something called experimental psychological reconditioning, a process that seemed to systematically document the complete mental breakdown of human beings. The local sheriff, Thomas Hartwell, would later recount finding a room where the walls were covered with photographs of the same faces. The before and after shots showed the horrifying transformation from normal, healthy individuals into hollow-eyed, vacant shells of humanity. Each photograph was numbered and cross-referenced with the preserved specimens. For over 20 years, the Thornfield sisters had operated what they called a private therapeutic facility for the mentally afflicted. Wealthy families from across New England had sent their troubled relatives to this remote estate, trusting that the four sisters possessed revolutionary methods of treatment. What they had actually sent their loved ones to was something far more sinister. A place where the boundaries between healing and horror had been obliterated in the name of scientific progress. The authorities tried to suppress the details of what they found. The official report stated simply that the facility had been operating outside acceptable medical standards, but the truth was far more disturbing. The Thornfield sisters had been conducting psychological experiments that would have been unthinkable even in the darkest corners of European asylums. Before we continue with the story of the Thornfield estate and uncover the full extent of what transpired within those walls, this channel isn't for everyone. It's only for the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. Few channels have the courage to tell the stories we tell here. Will you join the select few who know these secrets? The fire that destroyed the Thornfield estate wasn't an accident. It was set by the only surviving patient, a woman named Sarah Peaton, who had somehow retained enough of her sanity to understand what was happening to her. In the 1840s, Cumberland County, Maine, was a place where old Puritan values collided with new ideas about medicine and the human mind. The region had grown prosperous from its timber industry and shipping trade, creating a new class of wealthy merchants and industrialists. These families, like their counterparts throughout New England, often faced a peculiar problem: what to do with family members who exhibited signs of mental disturbance. In 1845, the concept of mental illness was poorly understood. Conditions we now recognize as depression, anxiety, or bipolar disorder were often seen as moral failings or, worse, as signs of inherent weakness that could taint an entire family's reputation. Wealthy families desperately sought discreet solutions, places where their troubled relatives could be sent away from public scrutiny while receiving what they hoped would be effective treatment. It was into this environment that the four Thornfield sisters arrived in the autumn of 1844. Constance, the eldest at 32, was a woman of striking intelligence and an unsettling presence. She had studied briefly at the Troy Female Seminary in New York, where she had developed what she called revolutionary theories about the malleable nature of human consciousness. Her sister Margaret, 2 years younger, possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotional states and vulnerabilities. The younger sisters, Eleanor and Beatrice, were twins who had developed their own dark specializations. Eleanor had trained as an apothecary and had an extensive knowledge of plant-based compounds that could alter mental states. Beatrice, the youngest, had spent time in European hospitals and claimed to have studied under physicians who were exploring the physical foundations of madness. Together, they presented themselves as progressive healers who had developed methods that could cure even the most severe forms of mental disturbance. They spoke eloquently about the need to understand the mind through systematic observation and controlled intervention. Their approach sounded scientific, rational, and hopeful, exactly what desperate families wanted to hear. The sisters purchased the old Hartwell mansion, an imposing 3-story structure that had been abandoned for nearly a decade after its previous owner died under mysterious circumstances. The building sat on 200 acres of heavily forested land, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense pine forests. The isolation that had made the property undesirable to most buyers was exactly what the Thornfield sisters were seeking. They spent months renovating the mansion, installing what they described as specialized treatment facilities. Local workers were hired to construct additional rooms in the basement, to install heavy doors with small observation windows, and to create a complex system of speaking tubes that would allow the sisters to communicate with patients without direct contact. The renovations were supervised by Constance, who seemed to have detailed plans for every modification. She insisted on soundproofing for the basement rooms, explaining that this would help create a therapeutic environment free from external disturbances. She also required the installation of a sophisticated ventilation system that would allow for the introduction of medicinal vapors into individual rooms. By the spring of 1845, the Thornfield Therapeutic Institute was ready to receive its first patients. The sisters had advertised their services through discreet channels, private letters to prominent physicians, quiet conversations at social gatherings, and carefully placed notices in medical journals. They promised complete confidentiality and revolutionary results. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Wealthy families throughout New England began making inquiries about the Institute's services. The sisters were selective in their admissions, choosing only patients whose families could afford substantial fees and who could be sent away without raising too many questions about their whereabouts. The first patient to arrive at the Thornfield Institute was James Wentworth, the 24-year-old son of a prominent Boston merchant. James had been exhibiting what his family described as episodes of extreme melancholy and inappropriate behavior following his return from Harvard College. Modern psychiatrists would likely have diagnosed him with what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, possibly triggered by a traumatic incident during his studies. James arrived at the Institute on a grey April morning in 1845, accompanied by his father and a family physician. The Thornfield sisters met them at the front door of the mansion, presenting themselves as the picture of professional competence and compassion. Constance spoke with quiet authority about their treatment methods, while Margaret demonstrated an uncanny ability to quickly identify the specific anxieties that plagued the young man. The family was given a tour of the public areas of the Institute, comfortable sitting rooms, a well-appointed library, and what appeared to be a standard medical examination room. Everything seemed designed to reassure worried families that their loved ones would receive the finest care available. The sisters explained that their methods required complete isolation from outside influences, so family visits would not be permitted during the initial treatment phase. James's father paid the substantial fee, equivalent to nearly $30,000 in today's money, and left his son in what he believed were capable hands. It would be the last time he would see his son alive, though he wouldn't learn of James's fate for more than 20 years. What actually happened to James Wentworth began within hours of his family's departure. The sisters had developed what they called systematic psychological deconstruction, a process designed to completely break down a patient's existing personality structure so that it could be rebuilt according to their specifications. James was initially housed in what appeared to be a comfortable bedroom on the second floor. However, this was merely the beginning of a carefully orchestrated process. Over the following days, his environment was systematically altered in ways designed to create confusion and anxiety. Furniture was moved during the night, meals were served at irregular intervals, and the temperature in his room was constantly adjusted. The sisters had discovered that human beings rely on environmental consistency to maintain psychological stability. By introducing seemingly random changes to a patient's surroundings, they could begin to undermine the person's sense of reality and self-control. James began to question his own perceptions, wondering if he was experiencing another episode or if the changes were actually occurring. Eleanor's expertise with plant-based compounds came into play during this initial phase. James's food was gradually laced with small amounts of substances that would heighten his anxiety and confusion without causing obvious physical symptoms. He began to experience what he described in his journal, which the sisters encouraged him to keep as part of his therapeutic process, as waking dreams and strange visions. The sisters monitored James's deterioration through a network of hidden observation panels and speaking tubes. They recorded every change in his behavior, every expression of confusion or fear, every attempt to make sense of his increasingly unstable environment. To them, James was not a human being in need of help, but a fascinating specimen whose responses to their interventions could provide valuable data about the nature of human consciousness. After 2 weeks of this psychological manipulation, James was moved to the basement level of the institute. He was told that this was necessary for the intensive phase of his treatment. The basement room where he was housed appeared medical in nature, with white walls, a single bed, and what looked like scientific equipment. However, the room had been designed for a very different purpose than healing. The sisters had created what they called controlled sensory environments, spaces where every aspect of a patient's experience could be manipulated with scientific precision. James's room could be plunged into complete darkness or flooded with blinding light at the sisters' discretion. Sound could be introduced or eliminated entirely. The temperature could be adjusted to create either stifling heat or bone-chilling cold. But the most insidious aspect of James's new environment was the constant presence of the sisters themselves. Through the speaking tube system, they could communicate with him at any time, day or night. They began to engage him in what they called psychological dialogues, conversations designed to systematically undermine his sense of self and reality. Constance would spend hours questioning James about his memories, suggesting that events he clearly remembered had never actually occurred. Margaret would engage him in discussions about his fears and anxieties, gradually amplifying them until they became overwhelming obsessions. Eleanor would describe in clinical detail the physical changes she observed in his behavior, making him acutely self-conscious about every gesture and expression. The sisters documented every aspect of James's response to their treatment. They recorded his sleep patterns, his emotional reactions, his attempts to resist their interventions, and his gradual surrender to their control. They were particularly interested in what they called breaking points, moments when a patient's psychological defenses would completely collapse. James's breaking point came after 6 weeks of systematic psychological torture. The sisters had discovered that he harbored deep guilt about an incident at Harvard involving the death of a classmate. By constantly referencing this event and suggesting that James was responsible for far more than he had admitted, they gradually drove him to a state of complete mental collapse. The young man, who had arrived at the institute as a troubled but fundamentally rational individual, had been transformed into something entirely different. The sisters' notes from this period described James as having achieved what they called complete psychological malleability, a state in which his sense of self had been so thoroughly destroyed that it could be rebuilt according to their specifications. The transformation of James Wentworth was just the beginning. Over the following months, the Thornfield Institute received a steady stream of patients, each one carefully selected based on their family's wealth and their psychological vulnerabilities. The sisters had developed a sophisticated intake process that allowed them to identify individuals who would respond most dramatically to their experimental treatments. They preferred patients who suffered from what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders, depression, or trauma-related conditions. These individuals were already in a state of psychological distress, making them more susceptible to the sisters' manipulations. The sisters avoided patients with conditions that might make them unpredictable or dangerous, focusing instead on those whose suffering could be systematically amplified and redirected. Each new patient followed a similar trajectory to James Wentworth. They would arrive at the institute with hope for recovery, only to be gradually subjected to increasingly intensive psychological manipulation. The sisters had refined their techniques with each successive patient, developing what they considered to be a precise science of mental destruction and reconstruction. The basement of the institute was expanded to accommodate more patients, with each room designed for specific types of psychological experimentation. Some rooms were equipped with mirrors arranged in ways that would create disorienting visual effects. Others contained mechanical devices that could produce specific sounds or vibrations. The sisters had even created rooms where the walls could be moved to gradually reduce the available space, creating a sense of claustrophobia that would intensify over time. Margaret had developed what she called emotional amplification techniques, methods of identifying a patient's deepest fears and anxieties and then creating experiences that would make those fears seem to manifest in reality. She became an expert at reading the subtle signs of psychological distress and knew exactly when to introduce new stresses that would push a patient closer to a complete breakdown. Eleanor's pharmaceutical experiments became increasingly sophisticated. She developed compounds that could produce specific psychological effects, substances that would enhance paranoia, increase suggestibility, or create vivid hallucinations. Her knowledge of plant-based chemistry allowed her to create drugs that would leave no obvious physical traces while producing profound mental effects. Beatrice focused on what she called physiological conditioning, the use of physical discomfort to reinforce psychological manipulation. She developed techniques for using temperature, lighting, and sound to create physical sensations that would support the psychological narratives being constructed by her sisters. The sisters worked as a coordinated team, with each one contributing her specialized knowledge to the systematic destruction of their patients' mental stability. They viewed their work not as torture but as groundbreaking scientific research that would revolutionize the understanding of human consciousness. By the winter of 1845, the Institute housed more than 30 patients, each one in various stages of psychological reconstruction. The sisters had developed detailed protocols for their treatments, with careful notes about which techniques were most effective for different types of mental disturbance. They began to see patterns in their patients' responses, leading them to develop increasingly sophisticated theories about the nature of human psychology. The isolation of the Institute meant that the sisters could conduct their experiments without outside interference. The families who had sent their relatives to the facility received regular letters, written by the sisters but supposedly from the patients themselves, describing their progress and their gratitude for the excellent care they were receiving. These letters were carefully crafted to reassure families while providing plausible explanations for why visits were still not advisable. Local residents in Cumberland County began to notice strange things about the Thornfield Institute. Deliveries of unusual supplies, large quantities of medical equipment, strange chemicals, and what appeared to be scientific instruments, arrived regularly. The sisters employed very few local workers, preferring to handle most of the Institute's operations themselves. Those who did work at the Institute reported unsettling experiences. Groundskeepers spoke of hearing strange sounds coming from the basement of the building, particularly during the night hours. Delivery workers noticed that the sisters insisted on receiving all packages personally and would not allow outsiders to enter the building unsupervised. Most disturbing were the reports from local physicians who had been consulted by the sisters about various medical supplies and equipment. Dr. Samuel Crawford, who practiced in nearby Portland, later testified that Constance Thornfield had inquired about techniques for preserving human tissue samples and had asked detailed questions about the effects of various drugs on mental function. But perhaps the most telling sign that something was terribly wrong at the Institute came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1846, a young woman named Mary Hutchinson escaped from the facility and made her way to the town of Falmouth, nearly 15 miles away. She was found wandering the streets in a state of complete disorientation, unable to remember her own name or explain how she had arrived there. Mary was taken to the local physician, Dr. Edmund Foster, who was shocked by her condition. She exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma and appeared to be suffering from what we would now recognize as dissociative disorder. More disturbing were the physical signs of her ordeal, evidence of prolonged confinement, malnutrition, and what appeared to be systematic abuse. Dr. Foster attempted to help Mary recover her memory and identity. Over the course of several weeks, fragments of her experience at the Thornfield Institute began to emerge. She spoke of being kept in a small room with no windows, of voices that would speak to her through the walls, and of strange substances that were forced into her food and drink. Most chilling were Mary's descriptions of the sisters themselves. She spoke of women who would observe her constantly, taking notes about her behavior and responses. She described being subjected to various treatments that seemed designed to break down her sense of self rather than heal her mind. Dr. Foster was deeply troubled by Mary's account and attempted to investigate the Thornfield Institute. However, when he contacted the facility, he was told that no one named Mary Hutchinson had ever been a patient there. The sisters claimed that Dr. Foster had been deceived by a delusional woman who had fabricated her entire story. The incident was reported to local authorities, but the investigation was brief and inconclusive. The sisters' reputation as legitimate medical practitioners, combined with their connections to prominent families throughout New England, protected them from serious scrutiny. The case was closed after the sisters provided documentation that appeared to account for all of their patients. Mary Hutchinson was placed in a county asylum, where she died 6 months later. The official cause of death was listed as mental exhaustion, but Dr. Foster suspected that she had been deliberately poisoned. However, he had no evidence to support his suspicions, and the case was forgotten. The incident did have one lasting effect. Dr. Foster began to quietly investigate other reports of unusual activities at the Thornfield Institute. Over the following months, he documented a pattern of strange occurrences that suggested the sisters were conducting activities far beyond the scope of legitimate medical practice. Dr. Foster's investigation into the Thornfield Institute began to reveal a disturbing pattern of deception and manipulation that extended far beyond the facility itself. Through careful inquiry among his medical colleagues throughout New England, he discovered that the sisters had been making inquiries about experimental treatments and unusual medical supplies at multiple locations. Dr. Harrison Webb, a physician in Boston, reported that Constance Thornfield had visited his practice in early 1845, claiming to be researching advanced techniques for treating mental disturbance. She had asked detailed questions about the effects of various drugs on brain function and had inquired about methods for preserving human tissue samples for extended periods. Similar reports came from physicians in Providence, Hartford, and Portsmouth. The sisters had been systematically gathering information about experimental medical techniques, psychological theories, and pharmaceutical compounds. They had presented themselves as legitimate researchers working on behalf of a private medical institute that was developing revolutionary treatments for mental illness. More troubling were the reports from apothecaries and medical supply companies. Eleanor Thornfield had been purchasing large quantities of substances that had no legitimate medical use, compounds that were known to produce hallucinations, increase suggestibility, or cause severe psychological distress. She had also acquired equipment that seemed designed for restraining patients rather than treating them. Dr. Foster began to suspect that the Thornfield Institute was not simply using unorthodox treatment methods, but was actually conducting systematic experiments on human subjects. The sisters appeared to be using their patients as test subjects for psychological and pharmaceutical research that would have been considered unethical even by the standards of the 1840s. His investigation received an unexpected boost in the summer of 1846 when he was contacted by a former employee of the institute. Martha Henley had worked as a cook at the facility for several months before abruptly leaving her position. She had been reluctant to discuss her experiences, but Dr. Foster's gentle questioning eventually convinced her to reveal what she had witnessed. Martha's account was both specific and deeply disturbing. She described a facility where patients were kept in basement rooms that resembled prison cells more than medical treatment areas. She had been instructed to prepare meals according to very specific instructions, including the addition of substances that Eleanor Thornfield provided. These substances had strange effects on the patients, causing them to become either extremely agitated or unnaturally calm. Most chilling was Martha's description of the sisters' behavior toward their patients. She had observed them conducting what appeared to be experiments rather than treatments. Patients would be subjected to various stimuli, loud noises, bright lights, extreme temperatures, while the sisters carefully recorded their responses. Martha also described the extensive record-keeping that the sisters maintained. They kept detailed journals about each patient's condition, behavior, and responses to various treatments. These records were maintained with scientific precision, suggesting that the sisters viewed their work as research rather than healing. The cook's testimony provided Dr. Foster with crucial evidence, but it also revealed the extent of the sisters' careful planning. Martha had been hired from outside the local community and had been required to sign an agreement that prohibited her from discussing her work at the institute. Similar agreements had been signed by the few other employees who had worked at the facility. Dr. Foster realized that the sisters had created an elaborate system to conceal their activities. They had carefully isolated the institute from outside scrutiny, maintained false documentation about their patients, and intimidated potential witnesses into silence. The scope of their deception suggested that they had been planning their psychological experiments for years before actually implementing them. The investigation took a dramatic turn in the autumn of 1846, when Drive Foster received a letter from an unexpected source. The letter was from James Wentworth's father, who had become increasingly concerned about his son's prolonged absence from family events and his failure to respond to letters. The elder Wentworth had been assured by the sisters that his son was making excellent progress and that continued isolation was necessary for his recovery. However, he had begun to suspect that something was wrong when the letters supposedly written by his son began to exhibit dramatic changes in handwriting and vocabulary. The letters that James had supposedly written during his first months at the institute were consistent with his previous correspondence, intelligent, articulate, and written in his distinctive handwriting. However, the more recent letters were dramatically different. The handwriting appeared shaky and uncertain. The vocabulary was much simpler, and the content suggested that James had undergone a fundamental change in personality. Dr. Foster compared the early and late letters and immediately recognized that they had been written by different people. The sisters had apparently been forging correspondence from James, and their forgeries had become increasingly crude as time passed. This suggested that something had happened to James that prevented him from writing his own letters. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery that similar patterns existed in correspondence from other patients at the institute. Families throughout New England had been receiving letters from their relatives that showed dramatic changes in handwriting, vocabulary, and personality. The sisters had been systematically forging communications to conceal the true condition of their patients. Dr. Foster began to piece together the horrifying truth about the Thornfield Institute. The sisters were not treating mental illness. They were systematically destroying the minds of their patients through psychological torture and pharmaceutical manipulation. The patients who had been sent to the facility for healing had instead been subjected to experiences that had permanently damaged their mental faculties. The scope of the sisters' crimes was staggering. Over the course of nearly 2 years, they had received more than 60 patients from prominent families throughout New England. Each patient had undergone systematic psychological destruction, with the sisters carefully documenting the process as if it were legitimate scientific research. What made the situation even more disturbing was the realization that the sisters appeared to believe that their work was scientifically valuable. Their careful record-keeping and systematic approach suggested that they viewed their patients not as human beings but as experimental subjects whose suffering could contribute to the advancement of knowledge about human psychology. Dr. Foster knew that he had uncovered evidence of crimes that were unprecedented in their scope and cruelty. However, he also realized that bringing the sisters to justice would be extremely difficult. They had powerful connections throughout New England, and their victims were individuals whose families had every reason to avoid public scrutiny of their relatives' mental health issues. The investigation reached a critical point in the winter of 1847, when Drive Foster received information that would finally provide him with the evidence needed to expose the Thornfield Institute. The information came from the most unexpected source imaginable, one of the sisters themselves. The information that would ultimately lead to the exposure of the Thornfield Institute came from Beatrice Thornfield, the youngest of the 4 sisters. In February 1847, she appeared at Dr. Foster's office in Portland, exhibiting signs of severe psychological distress and claiming that she could no longer participate in what she called the horrible work being conducted at the institute. Beatrice's appearance was shocking to Dr. Foster, who had previously encountered her only as a composed and professional medical practitioner. She was visibly agitated, spoke in rapid, disconnected sentences, and seemed to be suffering from the same type of psychological trauma that he had observed in Mary Hutchinson. The irony was not lost on Dr. Foster that one of the sisters appeared to be exhibiting symptoms similar to those of their victims. Through careful questioning, Dr. Foster learned that Beatrice had been experiencing what she called attacks of conscience about the work being conducted at the institute. She had initially believed that their psychological experiments were contributing to legitimate scientific knowledge about mental illness. However, she had gradually come to understand that they were systematically destroying human lives for no purpose other than their own intellectual curiosity. The breaking point for Beatrice had come when she witnessed the death of a patient named Thomas Bellingham, a young man from a prominent Providence family who had been sent to the institute for treatment of what would now be recognized as severe depression. The sisters had subjected Thomas to an experimental treatment that involved complete sensory deprivation combined with pharmaceutical manipulation designed to create terrifying hallucinations. The treatment had been designed to test the sisters' theory that extreme psychological stress could be used to reset a patient's mental state, allowing them to rebuild the person's personality from the ground up. However, Thomas had not responded to the treatment as expected. Instead of achieving the psychological breakdown that the sisters had intended, he had suffered what appeared to be a complete mental collapse that resulted in his death. Beatrice described finding Thomas in his cell, having apparently died of what she believed was sheer terror. His body showed no signs of physical injury, but his face was frozen in an expression of absolute horror. The sisters had disposed of his body in a manner that Beatrice refused to describe in detail, but she indicated that they had taken steps to ensure that no evidence of his death would ever be discovered. The death of Thomas Bellingham had forced Beatrice to confront the reality of what she and her sisters were doing.